Imagine this. A man rushes out of his apartment in the morning, coffee in one hand, phone in the other. He scrolls through emails, messages, news feeds, eyes glued to a glowing screen while his feet move automatically. He doesn't notice the warm sunlight spilling across the street. He doesn't hear the laughter of children walking to school. He doesn't feel the quiet rhythm of his own breath. To him, the world is a blur, a checklist, a race. Now picture another scene. A monk sweeps fallen leaves from the temple courtyard. He moves slowly, gently. Each stroke of the broom is not a task to finish, but a dance with the moment. The rustling leaves, the cool breeze, the sound of birds, everything is alive, everything is enough. His face is calm, almost luminous. Two people, two lives, two very different ways of moving through the same world. One is lost in a storm of doing. The other has found the secret of simply being. What separates them is not wealth, not luck, not even time. It is something far simpler, yet infinitely more profound. It is mindfulness. Mindfulness is often spoken of as awareness of the present moment. But that definition, while true, is like calling the ocean a collection of water. It doesn't capture the vastness, the depth, the life it holds. In Buddhism, mindfulness is the key, not just to one door, but to every door that leads to freedom, peace, and awakening. Think about keys for a moment. A key is small, almost insignificant when you hold it in your hand, but when you place it in the right lock, it changes everything. A door opens, a new world is revealed. The room you've been locked out of suddenly becomes accessible. Mindfulness is like that. To some, it seems like a simple practice, just breathing, just noticing. But in truth, it has the power to unlock every aspect of life. Why? Because mindfulness changes the way we see. And when the way we see changes, the way we live follows. When you are mindful, you begin to notice the tiny details that usually slip past you, the sparkle in someone's eyes when they smile, the way a drop of rain slides down a leaf, the subtle shift of emotion in your own heart. These details are not small at all, they are life itself. Without awareness, life passes unnoticed, unlived. With awareness, every moment becomes rich, full, miraculous. But mindfulness is not just about savoring beauty. It is also about facing suffering. A person without mindfulness runs away from pain, distracting themselves, numbing themselves, denying what is there. A person with mindfulness dares to look directly at pain, breathing with it, embracing it like a parent holding a crying child. And in that gentle embrace, suffering softens, loosens, transforms. This is why the Buddha placed mindfulness at the very heart of his teaching. Mindfulness is the foundation of the Noble Eightfold Path. It is the seed from which compassion, wisdom, and liberation grow. It is the key that fits every lock. Yet here is the paradox. Mindfulness is also the simplest thing in the world. It does not demand wealth, education, or power. It doesn't even require special circumstances. You don't have to escape to a mountaintop or a monastery. Mindfulness is available in this very breath, right where you are. The only question is whether you choose to turn the key. Perhaps you've had a glimpse of this before, maybe while watching a sunset that stole your breath. Maybe while holding the hand of someone you love, feeling time stand still. Maybe in the silence after laughter when everything feels whole. In those rare moments, the mind is not racing, not chasing, not regretting or anticipating. It is simply here, present, alive. That is mindfulness. The tragedy is that we often treat these moments as accidents, as rare gifts we cannot control. But the truth is, mindfulness can be cultivated. We can choose to live in that state of presence more often until it becomes our natural way of being. And when we do, doors begin to open, doors we didn't even know were there. The door to freedom from stress and anxiety. The door to compassion that heals broken relationships. The door to wisdom that sees life clearly without illusion. The door to everyday miracles hidden in plain sight. The door to resilience, to connection, to awakening. And it all begins with one step, the choice to be here now. So as you listen, imagine yourself standing before a door. It is not locked by anyone else. The key is already in your hand. The question is whether you will use it. Take a slow breath. Feel the air entering, leaving. Notice how even this small act done with attention feels different, calmer, fuller, more alive. This is not just the start of a practice. This is the start of a journey, one that leads deeper and deeper into the heart of what it means to be human. A journey where every step, every breath, every moment has the potential to unlock a new world. And as we begin to walk, you may start to sense something unsettling yet liberating. The reason so many of us feel lost, restless, and unsatisfied is because we have been wandering without mindfulness. We have been living with the key in our pocket, yet never turning it. The time has come to change that. Have you ever noticed how loud the world has become? Not just the sound of traffic or conversations, but the constant hum of notifications, reminders, advertisements, and demands. The mind rarely rests. Even in silence, there's a noise inside, an endless stream of thoughts pulling us forward, backward, anywhere but here. This is the prison we live in. Not one built of steel bars, but one built of distraction. We wake up and immediately reach for the phone. Before the first sip of water, our minds are already filled with headlines, opinions, and comparisons. We scroll through other people's lives, measuring ourselves against carefully polished images. We answer emails before we've even stretched our bodies. And without realizing it, we've started the day already trapped. The Buddha once spoke of the mind as a monkey, restless, leaping from branch to branch, never still. Today, that monkey has caffeine, a smartphone, and unlimited Wi-Fi. It jumps faster than ever, and with each jump, we lose a little more of ourselves. Distraction is not just an inconvenience, it is a thief. It steals our attention, our clarity, our presence. It robs us of moments that could have been deeply lived, the taste of food, the warmth of a loved one's voice, the stillness of morning air. Think about it. How many times have you eaten a meal without tasting it? How often have you been in conversation while secretly checking your messages? How often has your body been in one place while your mind was already racing toward the next task? This is why we feel lost, because to be truly alive is to be present, and distraction tears us away from presence. There's a story from Zen tradition. A man is being chased by a tiger. He runs and runs until he comes to the edge of a cliff. Desperate, he climbs down, clinging to a vine. Above him, the tiger waits. Below him, another tiger snarls. And as he hangs there between danger and death, he notices a single wild strawberry growing on the cliffside. With one hand, he plucks it. With one bite, he tastes it fully. And in that moment, despite everything, he is free. The strawberry was always there, but only when he turned his full attention to it did life reveal its sweetness. We, too, are hanging between tigers, the fears of tomorrow and the regrets of yesterday. And in our distraction, we miss the strawberry that is right in front of us. Modern life trains us to believe that productivity is the highest virtue. We are praised for multitasking, for being constantly reachable, for never stopping. But the irony is that this endless striving does not bring fulfillment. Instead, it leaves us exhausted, anxious, and strangely empty. Why? Because the human heart does not thrive on constant doing. It thrives on being. Without mindfulness, we mistake busyness for purpose. We confuse noise for meaning. And we wonder why, despite all our activity, a quiet dissatisfaction lingers in the background. The truth is, distraction is not neutral. It reshapes the mind. Neuroscience confirms what the Buddha taught long ago. What we repeatedly pay attention to becomes the pattern of our mind. If we constantly train our attention to scatter, to jump from one thing to another, we create a restless mind, unable to sit still, unable to truly listen, unable to go deep. And yet, there is hope, because the very same truth works in our favor. If we train the mind to be present, to focus, to rest in awareness, it will learn stillness, clarity, and peace. Imagine what life would feel like if you could taste every meal as if it were the first, listen to every friend as if they were the only one in the world, breathe every breath as if it were a gift. That is the freedom waiting beyond distraction. But before freedom comes recognition. We must first see the prison we are in. We must see how distraction chains us, not with iron, but with endless desire and fear. The Buddha called this samsara, the cycle of craving and aversion that keeps us spinning, restless, dissatisfied. Distraction is samsara in motion, pulling us away from the very door that leads to release. And so, the first step is awareness, to pause, to notice, to see the storm of distraction for what it is. Because once you see the prison clearly, you begin to understand the key is already within you. Take a breath now, just one. Feel it enter, feel it leave. Notice how the simple act of attention changes everything. In that moment, the bars of the prison grow weaker. The door begins to appear. And beyond that door lies something our restless minds have been craving all along. The quiet space where stress and anxiety no longer control us. Stress is a silent weight most of us carry. It shows up in the tightness of our shoulders, in the shallow rhythm of our breath, in the way our minds race even when our bodies are still. Anxiety, its restless companion, whispers fears about the future, replaying what-if scenarios like a broken record. Together, they drain our energy, dim our joy, and leave us feeling as if life is something we must endure rather than something we can truly live. But what if the weight could be set down? What if there was a door leading out of this endless cycle of tension and worry? That door is mindfulness. When you bring awareness to the present moment, something extraordinary happens. The storm of thoughts begins to settle. The body softens. The heart remembers that right here, right now, there is no danger. There is only breath. The Buddha taught that suffering is not caused by life itself, but by the way our minds cling to fear, resistance, and desire. Stress and anxiety are not built into reality, they are built inside us. And because they are built, they can also be unbuilt. Imagine a glass of muddy water. If you stir it constantly, the water stays cloudy. But if you set the glass down and leave it undisturbed, the mud begins to settle. Slowly, the water clears, revealing its natural purity. Our minds are the same. When constantly stirred by distraction and fear, they are clouded. But when held in mindfulness, stillness allows clarity to return. There's a story of a young man who once came to a Zen master saying, "My life is full of fear. My heart is restless. Please teach me how to be free." The master handed him a cup of tea. As the young man lifted it, the master said softly, "Before you drink, take one breath. Notice its beginning, its middle, its end." The young man did as told. The master then said, "Now drink, but only drink. Taste the tea as if there is nothing else in the world." The young man took a slow sip. For the first time in years, he felt his heart quiet. The tea was warm, alive, comforting. In that simple act of mindful drinking, the prison of anxiety loosened. He smiled through tears, realizing that freedom was not hidden in some distant place. It was here in the smallest of moments. This is the power of mindfulness. When anxiety pulls us into the future, mindfulness anchors us in the present. When stress tightens the body, mindfulness invites release. When thoughts spiral into chaos, mindfulness brings us back to the breath, steady, reliable, always here. And science agrees. Studies show that mindfulness meditation lowers cortisol, the stress hormone. It slows the heart rate, steadies blood pressure, and soothes the nervous system. But beyond science, there is the lived truth. When you practice mindfulness, you feel lighter. You discover that peace is not something you must earn or chase. It is already here, waiting for your attention. The first door mindfulness opens, then, is not mystical. It is deeply human. It is the door to relief, to feeling your chest expand with a full breath, to letting go of the constant tension that knots your body, to realizing that this moment right now is enough. Think of how many years are spent running after a future that never arrives. We say, "I'll rest when the work is done. I'll be happy when I succeed. I'll breathe when I have time." But the work is never fully done. Success always moves one step further. Time never offers itself unless we take it. The gift of mindfulness is that it cuts through this illusion. It reminds us that rest, happiness, and peace are not in the next moment. They are here. They have always been here. The first door, then, is an invitation to breathe, to rest, to be. To sit quietly for a few moments and notice the air moving in and out, the rise and fall of the chest, life happening inside you. It may seem small, almost trivial, But this is the doorway to freedom. And as you step through, something remarkable happens. The chains of stress begin to loosen. Anxiety no longer dictates every thought. The future loses its grip, the past its sting. And for the first time, you begin to taste a freedom that no external success could ever give. This is not to say life becomes free of challenges. Storms will still come. But when you are mindful, you no longer face them as a prisoner. You face them with steady breath, with a calm center, with the understanding that you are larger than any wave of worry. Stress may knock at your door, but it no longer holds the key to your mind. The Buddha once said, "Peace comes from within, do not seek it without." And mindfulness is the way we return to that inner peace. So as you sit here now, pause, notice one breath from beginning to end. Feel its cool entrance, its warm release. That's all, simple yet profound. That is freedom. That is the first door opening. And as you continue to walk this path, you may begin to notice another transformation. When you are free from the weight of your own stress, your heart naturally turns outward. You begin to see others more clearly. You begin to care more deeply. And from this calmness, compassion is born. When the storm of stress begins to quiet, something unexpected happens. In the stillness, your vision changes. You start to notice not just your own breath, but the breath of others. You begin to see the tired eyes of the cashier at the grocery store, the hidden sadness behind a friend's forced smile, the quiet loneliness of the stranger sitting alone. What once seemed invisible becomes vivid. This is the second door mindfulness opens, the door of compassion. Compassion is often misunderstood as pity or as kindness given only when it's convenient. But in Buddhism, compassion is something far deeper. It is the natural flowering of mindfulness. When you are present, you see clearly, and what you see is that suffering is everywhere. Not in a depressing way, but in a profoundly human way. The Buddha once said, "All beings tremble before violence, all fear death, all love life. See yourself in others, then whom can you harm?" Mindfulness reveals this truth directly. You realize that just as you wish to be free from pain, so does everyone else. Just as you long to be understood, so does every living being. And from this recognition, the heart softens. There's a story of a monk who meditated for many years in a cave, seeking wisdom. One day, as he walked down the mountain, he saw a wounded dog on the path. Its body was frail, its eyes filled with fear. The monk stopped, knelt down, and simply sat with the dog, breathing gently, radiating calmness. In that moment, his years of meditation came alive, not in abstract thoughts, but in the warmth of compassion. He later said that he felt closer to enlightenment in those few minutes with the suffering dog than in all his years alone in the cave. This is the essence of compassion, not grand gestures, but presence. To look at someone and truly see them. To listen without planning your reply. To offer your attention as a gift, reminding the other person, you are not alone. Mindfulness makes this possible because it clears the fog of self-absorption. Normally, our minds are so full of our own worries that we barely notice others. But when mindfulness calms our inner noise, space opens. And in that space, others enter. Their joy, their sorrow, their humanity becomes part of our own. Science, once again, supports what the Buddha taught. Studies show that mindfulness practice increases activity in the parts of the brain linked to empathy and compassion. People who meditate regularly are more likely to help strangers, more likely to forgive, and more capable of handling conflict peacefully. But beyond studies, there is the lived reality. Compassion feels natural when you are mindful because mindfulness awakens the heart. Think of the last time someone truly listened to you, not distracted, not waiting for their turn, but deeply present. Do you remember how healing that felt? That is the power of mindful compassion, and each of us has the capacity to offer it. Compassion is not weakness, it is strength. To open your heart in a world that often numbs itself with indifference requires courage. To care deeply in a culture that prizes competition and self-interest is revolutionary. The Buddha did not teach compassion as an optional virtue. He taught it as the very path to liberation. because in seeing the suffering of others, we also see the truth of our shared existence. The great Zen master Thich Nhat 1E5T once said, "Compassion is a verb. It is not just a feeling but an action. To smile at a stranger, to pause and ask if someone is okay, to forgive instead of resent, these are doors that open hearts, sometimes in ways we may never fully know." But compassion is not only directed outward, it must also be directed inward. For many of us, the harshest words we ever hear are the ones we speak to ourselves. We criticize, we judge, we punish ourselves for not being enough. Mindfulness reveals this too. And as we notice the suffering within, we can begin to extend compassion inward, speaking to ourselves as we would to a beloved friend. A woman once told a meditation teacher, "I can sit with others in their pain, but I cannot sit with my own. I feel unworthy of kindness." The teacher replied, "Start with one breath of compassion for yourself, just one, then two, then three. In time, the heart will remember that you too are a living being who deserves care." This self-compassion is not selfish. It is necessary, because only when we care for ourselves can we truly care for others without burning out. Compassion is like a flame. If we protect and nourish it, it can light countless candles without ever diminishing. And so, the door of compassion is not separate from the first door of freedom. They are connected. Once you are free from your own storms, you naturally begin to notice the storms of others. Once your own suffering softens, you naturally want to soften the suffering of those around you. This is why mindfulness is called the key to every door. It does not stop at personal peace. It expands outward, unlocking a love that includes all beings. And when compassion flows freely, something even greater begins to awaken. Wisdom, the ability to see reality as it truly is. When the heart opens with compassion, the eyes begin to see differently. It's as if a veil lifts. You no longer look at people as strangers or enemies, but as fellow travelers on the same fragile path. And in that clarity, something deeper stirs, the awakening of wisdom. Wisdom in Buddhism is not just intelligence or knowledge. It is not about gathering facts or clever arguments. True wisdom is the ability to see reality without distortion, without illusion, to see things as they are, not as we wish them to be. The Buddha often compared human perception to a dream. We walk through life believing we see clearly, yet so often we are clouded by fear, desire, or ignorance. We mistake what is temporary for permanent. We cling to what cannot be held. We chase after what we imagine will bring happiness, only to find ourselves still restless when we achieve it. This is not seeing reality, this is living in illusion. Mindfulness is the lens that clears our vision. When the mind is present and steady, we begin to notice truths that were always there, waiting to be seen. The first truth is impermanence. Everything changes. The flower blooms and fades. The child grows old. The joy you feel today may be sorrow tomorrow, and sorrow may turn again into joy. When you are mindful, impermanence is no longer frightening. It becomes beautiful. You cherish what is here because you know it will pass. You release what is gone because you know clinging cannot bring it back. The second truth is interconnection. Nothing exists alone. The paper you hold contains the sunshine, the rain, the soil, the logger, the truck that carried it, the store that sold it. You yourself contain your parents, your ancestors, the food you've eaten, the air you breathe. To see this clearly is to realize there is no separate self. Life is one vast, flowing web. And the third truth is emptiness. Not emptiness as nothingness, but emptiness as openness, the absence of a fixed, permanent identity. A cup is empty, and because it is empty, it can hold tea, water, or wine. In the same way, we are empty of a solid I, and because of that, we can transform, grow, and become. Mindfulness reveals this fluidity, this freedom. A Zen story tells of a student who asked his master, "What is enlightenment?" The master replied, "When hungry, eat, when tired, sleep." The student was puzzled. Wasn't enlightenment supposed to be something mysterious, something otherworldly? But the master was pointing to wisdom, seeing reality without adding layers of illusion. Eating is just eating. Sleeping is just sleeping. Life in its raw simplicity is already complete. When wisdom blossoms, suffering begins to loosen. We no longer cling to what cannot last. We no longer fight what must change. We no longer feel isolated in our own skin. Instead, we live in harmony with the flow of life, grounded in truth. But wisdom is not cold. It is not a detached view from above. In Buddhism, wisdom and compassion are two wings of the same bird. Compassion opens the heart, wisdom opens the eyes. Together they allow us to fly. Imagine standing at the ocean's edge. Without mindfulness, you only see the waves crashing loud, chaotic, overwhelming. With mindfulness, you begin to notice the vastness of the ocean itself. The waves still come, but they are seen for what they are. Temporary movements of something far deeper, far greater. In the same way, wisdom allows us to see our thoughts, our emotions, our lives as waves on the great ocean of being. They rise, they fall, but the ocean remains. This is not abstract philosophy. It is profoundly practical. When you know a thought is just a wave, you don't drown in it. When you know pain is impermanent, you bear it with greater strength. When you know the self is not separate, you live with more kindness and less fear. This is the door of wisdom, a door that opens to freedom from illusion. And once you step through, even the smallest details of life shine differently. A raindrop becomes a teacher of impermanence. A smile becomes a reminder of interconnection. A moment of silence becomes a taste of emptiness. And yet, wisdom does not pull us away from ordinary life. It returns us to it. We begin to see that the extraordinary is hidden within the ordinary, that the sacred is not somewhere else, but right here in every breath, every step, every glance. When the eyes of wisdom open, even the most mundane acts reveal themselves as miracles. And it is through this vision that the next door appears, the door to everyday miracles, waiting quietly in the simple rhythm of daily life. When wisdom clears our vision, something extraordinary happens. We begin to notice the beauty we once overlooked, the quiet miracles hidden in the fabric of daily life. It's easy to think miracles are rare, walking on water, turning darkness into light, summoning the impossible. But the greatest miracle is not to defy nature, it is to be fully present with it. To see the ordinary with eyes so open, it becomes extraordinary. Take the breath. How many times have you inhaled and exhaled today without a second thought? Yet each breath is a miracle, invisible, effortless, sustaining your very life. Without it, nothing else would matter. To notice a single breath with gratitude is to stand in awe of existence itself. Or consider a simple glass of water, clear, tasteless, ordinary. But within it is a cloud, a river, the earth, the sun. Entire ecosystems have conspired to bring that water to your lips. Is that not a miracle? Thich Nh letter 1E5T H letter 1E1NH, the beloved Zen teacher, once said, "The miracle is not to walk on water, the miracle is to walk on the earth." Think about that. Every step you take, the ground beneath you is carrying billions of years of life, supporting you without condition. And yet, how often do we rush across it, blind to its gift? A smile from a stranger, the warmth of sunlight on your face, the sound of rain tapping gently on the roof. These are not interruptions to life, they are life. Mindfulness is the key that allows us to pause, to notice, to receive them as the miracles they are. There's a story of a man rushing through a crowded city, stressed and exhausted. He passed by a street musician playing the violin, but he never heard the music. His mind was too loud, his heart too restless. Hours later, he complained of how empty life felt. The truth was simple. The miracle had been there, but he was not. When we are lost in distraction, life becomes gray, repetitive, dull. When we are mindful, the same life bursts into color. A flower is no longer just decoration. It is a symphony of sun, soil, and time. A meal is no longer just fuel. It is the universe offering itself in nourishment. This way of seeing does not require wealth, status, or special conditions. It only requires presence. And presence is available to anyone, anywhere, at any moment. But here's the secret. The more you notice these small miracles, the less you hunger for grand escapes. Stress loosens. Dissatisfaction softens. Joy arises naturally because you no longer wait for something extraordinary to happen. You realize it already has. The everyday becomes sacred. Washing dishes becomes a meditation. Walking to the bus stop becomes a pilgrimage. Drinking tea becomes communion with the earth. When you live this way, even pain changes. A tear becomes proof that the heart is alive. A moment of silence becomes a space wide enough to hold the whole universe. This is the door of everyday miracles. Once it opens, life is no longer something you rush through to get somewhere else. Life itself becomes the destination. And in that stillness, in that wonder, another door quietly reveals itself. A door that invites us not only to see the miracles outside, but to discover the vast universe within. Life, as beautiful as it is, will never be free from pain. No matter how mindful, no matter how wise, there will still be days when loss visits, when illness strikes, when the weight of sorrow feels unbearable. Even the Buddha himself did not escape old age, sickness, or death. But here lies the truth. Resilience is not about avoiding suffering. It is about meeting it with courage, with presence, with a heart that refuses to break even when it bends. Think of bamboo in the wind. A rigid tree may snap under the storm, but bamboo sways, bends low, and when the storm passes, it rises again. That is resilience, the strength of flexibility, the courage of softness. Mindfulness gives us this power. When pain comes, our first instinct is to run, to distract ourselves, to numb ourselves, to pretend it isn't there. But what if, instead of running, we paused? What if we breathed, turned toward the pain, and allowed ourselves to truly feel it? It sounds terrifying, but in that moment of turning, something changes. The suffering that seemed monstrous becomes simply a wave. Heavy, yes. Overwhelming, perhaps, but still a wave. And like every wave, it will rise, crest, and pass. There's a story of the Buddha meeting a grieving woman whose child had died. She begged him for medicine to bring the boy back. The Buddha did not give her an explanation or a lecture. Instead, he asked her to collect mustard seeds from any household that had never known death. She searched the village, knocking door to door, only to discover that every family had lost someone. In her sorrow, she saw the universal truth. Suffering is part of the human condition. And in that realization, her grief softened into acceptance. This is resilience. The ability to hold suffering not as a punishment, but as part of being alive. When you see that suffering touches everyone, you no longer feel singled out, abandoned, or cursed. You realize you are not alone. Mindfulness also transforms how we carry pain. Instead of drowning in the story, why me, why now, we anchor in the present. We notice this is sadness, this is fear, this is pain. Naming it gently without judgment creates space between us and the suffering. It is no longer my whole life. It is simply a passing visitor. Resilience does not mean we never cry. It means we cry fully, without shame, and still continue. It does not mean we never fall. It means we rise again, with more wisdom each time. Courage in this sense is not loud or dramatic. It is quiet. It is the courage to take one more breath when the heart feels shattered. The courage to smile again after tears. The courage to trust that even in the darkest night, dawn is already preparing to return. And here's the paradox. The very suffering we fear often becomes our greatest teacher. Loss shows us the preciousness of life. Failure teaches humility and strength. Pain reveals compassion for others who suffer too. As Rumi wrote, "The wound is the place where the light enters you." When you meet suffering with courage, it no longer defines you. It refines you. It chisels away what is false, leaving only what is essential. This is the door of resilience. To step through it is to discover a strength you didn't know you had, a strength born not from resistance but from surrender. And as you walk this path, you begin to see, resilience is not just about enduring suffering, it is about transforming it into wisdom, into compassion, into light. Beyond this door lies another gift, the stillness of peace. The kind of peace that is not shaken by storms because it is rooted deeper than circumstances. a peace that whispers quietly even in the chaos, "You are safe, you are whole, you are home." When the storm of suffering softens and the heart discovers peace, something beautiful begins to awaken. You start to feel that your life is not separate, not contained within the borders of your skin, but part of something infinitely larger. This is the door of connection, the realization that you are one with all beings. Think of the ocean. Every wave rises and falls, distinct for a moment, yet never apart from the water itself. In the same way, each of us appears as an individual with our names, our faces, our stories. But beneath it all, we are the ocean of life itself, moving, breathing, unfolding together. The Buddha once taught that when we look deeply into ourselves, we find not a fixed I, but the presence of countless others. The food we eat, the air we breathe, the love we receive, all of it is woven into our being. You are not just you. You are your parents, your ancestors, the teachers who shaped you, the strangers who planted rice, baked bread, stitched clothes, carried water. In truth, the whole universe is within you. When mindfulness sharpens this awareness, something shifts. The stranger on the street is no longer a stranger. They are part of your own life. The suffering of a child on the other side of the world is not distant. It touches your heart as if it were your own. Compassion becomes natural because you see clearly. Harming another is harming yourself. Caring for another is caring for yourself. There's a story of a monk who would bow to every person, every tree, every stone on the path. When asked why, he replied, "Because each of them is me and I am them." This was not poetry, it was wisdom. When you truly see interconnection, respect and reverence arise effortlessly. And it's not only humans. When you drink tea, can you see the cloud floating inside the cup? Without the cloud, there would be no rain, no tree, no leaf, no tea. When you breathe, can you feel the forest entering your lungs? Every breath is a gift from trees, and every exhale is your gift back to them. In this dance, there is no separation between you and the earth. Modern life often tells us we are isolated individuals, competing for survival, chasing personal success. But this illusion breeds loneliness, division, and fear. Mindfulness cuts through the illusion. It shows us that life is not a battlefield, but a shared home. We are threads in one vast tapestry, and here lies the paradox. When you see that you are connected to all, you do not lose yourself. You find yourself. You discover a self that is larger, freer, and more compassionate than the small identity you once clung to. This door of connection transforms how you live. Gratitude blossoms because you see the infinite hands that support you. Kindness flows because the boundary between me and you grows thin. Responsibility deepens because you know your choices ripple outward, touching countless lives. Imagine a world where everyone lived with this awareness. Wars would end, greed would fade, cruelty would dissolve, because harming another would feel like harming your own child, your own body, your own soul. Connection is not an abstract idea. It is as close as your breath, as near as the ground beneath your feet. When you open this door, life becomes a symphony, and you are both a note and the whole song. And as you rest in this unity, a final door comes into view. A door that reveals not just connection with others, but the deepest awakening of all. The realization of your true nature, beyond birth and death, beyond fear and time. When connection blossoms, when you see yourself in all beings and all beings within yourself, the heart begins to long for something even greater: freedom. Not just freedom from stress or fear or sorrow, but freedom from the endless cycle itself. This is the ultimate door. Liberation from suffering, the awakening that the Buddha called nirvana. For countless lives, humans have been bound by a chain, craving, clinging, and becoming. We chase what we desire, we resist what we fear, and in that endless chase, we create new suffering, new attachments, new identities. This cycle is what Buddhism calls samsara, the wheel of birth and death, spinning endlessly, carrying us from joy to sorrow, from gain to loss, from hope to despair. But liberation is possible. It begins with a single realization: nothing you cling to can truly satisfy you. Wealth fades, youth withers, relationships shift, Even the sweetest moment cannot last. And yet, when you stop clinging, when you release the desperate grasping, you discover something astonishing, a peace that does not depend on conditions, a freedom that cannot be taken away. The Buddha compared it to a flame that goes out, not destroyed, not lost, but free. Free from the fuel of craving, free from the winds of illusion. Nirvana is not a place to reach after death. It is a state of awakening available here, now, in this very breath, if the mind is clear enough to see. But what does it feel like? Imagine carrying a heavy pack on your back for years without rest. The straps dig into your shoulders, the weight bends your spine, and you believe this burden is simply part of being alive. Then one day you set it down. The relief is indescribable. The world feels lighter, brighter, more spacious. That is liberation, the dropping of what was never truly yours to begin with. This freedom is not selfish. On the contrary, it is the deepest gift to the world. When you are liberated from greed, you no longer exploit others. When you are liberated from hatred, you no longer harm. When you are liberated from delusion, you no longer spread confusion. Your very presence becomes a refuge, your life becomes a teaching. There's a story of the Buddha after his awakening. For 7 days, he simply sat beneath the Bodhi tree, silent, radiant, smiling. He did not speak. He did not teach. He just was. And those who saw him felt something beyond words. They felt peace. This is the power of liberation. It shines without effort, touching others without even trying. Liberation does not mean you disappear from life. You still eat, laugh, walk, and speak. But you do so without chains, without illusions. Birth and death no longer frighten you because you know you are not limited to this body, this moment, this name. You are the ocean, not just the wave. This is the ultimate door, and it is not locked. The key is already in your hand: mindfulness, passion, wisdom, resilience, connection. Every door we have walked through leads here, and when this door opens, the cycle ends. The wheel no longer binds you. And yet liberation is not the end of the journey. It is also the beginning of a new way of being, living each moment as a gift, sharing your light with all beings still searching for the path. As the Buddha said, "Go forth for the welfare of the many." The liberated one does not turn away from the world. They return to guide, to comfort, to remind us all that freedom is possible. And now, as we stand before the closing chapter, there is one final door to open, not a new teaching, not a distant goal, but an invitation. To live this wisdom in your own life, every day, every breath, from this moment on. We have walked together through many doors, doors of freedom, compassion, wisdom, resilience, connection, and finally, liberation. But a question still lingers: what now? The truth is, the journey does not end in a monastery, on a mountain, or even under a Bodhi tree. It continues right here in the buzzing, restless, fast-moving world we live in. This is where mindfulness must bloom, where wisdom must take root, where compassion must breathe. To live mindfully in the modern world is not to escape it. It is to walk through it with open eyes and a steady heart. Your phone rings, your inbox fills, traffic builds, bills pile up. These are not obstacles to mindfulness. They are invitations. Each challenge is another doorway asking, will you react with distraction or respond with presence? Mindfulness is not fragile. It is not reserved for silent retreats or distant temples. It is strong enough to stand in the noise of the city, in the rush of deadlines, in the chaos of family life. Each breath can be an anchor. Each step can be a prayer. Each smile can be a teaching. Living this way does not require perfection. You will forget. You will stumble. You will fall back into old patterns. But the practice is not about never falling. It is about always returning. Each moment you remember is a victory. Each moment of awareness is a doorway opening again. And here's the gift. When you live with mindfulness, you change more than yourself. You change the world around you. Your calm becomes a refuge for others. Your compassion becomes medicine. Your wisdom becomes a light in the dark. Without preaching, without effort, you become a reminder of what is possible. In this modern age of distraction, the greatest revolution is presence. The bravest act is kindness. The truest success is peace. So as this journey closes, a new one begins. The doors are before you now, not in words, not in ideas, but in life itself. The door of your breath waiting in this moment. The door of your next step carrying you forward. The door of your own heart always ready to open. All you must do is walk through. And when you do, you will discover what the Buddha and countless teachers have known all along. Mindfulness is not just a practice. It is the key to every door. If these words touched your heart, let them be more than just sounds fading into silence. Carry them into your breath, into your steps, into your daily life. And if this journey resonated with you, I invite you to walk with us further. Subscribe to Zen Buddhism Wisdom and join a community of seekers who, like you, are opening the doors of mindfulness, compassion, and awakening. Each video is another step, another reminder, another moment of presence. Together, we can keep this light alive. Thank you for listening. May you be peaceful, may you be free, may you be home in every breath.